So Tom Foley, a great gubernatorial candidate in Connecticut, or the greatest gubernatorial candidate in the history of Connecticut? Michael?
Thanks, Dave. Depends on your perspective. If you're a Democrat, you would think that he's the greatest Republican gubernatorial candidate, and because he's such a bad candidate. What I really think that this election shows is that
Sarah Palin-esque?
Worse, from my point of view. Really, I mean, not as colorful, and it pales by comparison even to Sarah Palin. I mean, she at least had the good grace to be colorful, but he's really a dry piece of toast. What I really think that this election shows that President Bush has absolutely no coattails. Anybody who had anything to do with his administration or his policies in Iraq have no future in public service at all. And
so Foley was actually one of the key guys in Iraq after shock and awe, after we toppled the statue and took over the country. What was his part in that?
So you had Bremer was the head. He was the head of the Coalitional Provisional Authority. He was the ambassador. Underneath him, you had three parts. You had military reconstruction, economic reconstruction, and political reconstruction. Mm-hmm. So the part that I was in was military reconstruction. Foley was the head of economic reconstruction in Iraq, and their job, his mission, was basically to build a radical right-wing privatized capitalist economy. So Iraq was a command-driven, state-driven economy, and
could it be fair to say socialist in a sense?
It was socialist. It was, but not left-wing socialist. It was right-wing socialist. In fact, they were Nazis. The Ba'ath Party were the Islamic version of Nazis, and so they were right-wing socialists. And his mission was to privatize every single part of any manufacturing base or any business that was state-owned in Iraq and sell it off to. The plan was to sell it off to international businesses, and they would privatize Iraq completely, make it a corporate-run state entity, and it didn't happen. He started a stock market in Baghdad, which, to my thinking, when you're looking at creating a nation or reconstructing a nation, a stock market is not high on your list of priorities. We destroyed the medical infrastructure, we destroyed the water infrastructure, we destroyed all the infrastructures, and basically we destroyed all administrative, civilian administration in the country. But what they wanted to do really was create a means to get capital into the country to start investing in the country, and it had disastrous consequences.
What about the oil? Oh, before we go any further, actually, this Progressive Soup, I'm David Stevenson. We have back for quite, fourth or fifth or sixth time on the show, a great guest, Michael Zacchea, a retired lieutenant colonel from the United States Marine Corps. Amongst his accomplishments was that he was in Somalia during Black Hawk Down, during that era, when it actually took place, when Black Hawk Down, the movie, actually took place.
Actually, just a point of clarity. I was there right after it happened. Yeah.
Okay. In Iraq, training Iraqi troops, retraining Iraqi troops after the army was disbanded post invasion. Why did they disband the army?
They disbanded the army. I've heard several versions or several different reasons why. One reason is that they said they were just formalizing something that had already happened, and we were very interested. So we asked the Iraqi officers that were with our battalion, what happened, after the invasion, and they told us that their generals just told them to go home and to wait for orders. So in their minds, they were not defeated by the Americans, that they just went home and were waiting for. And the Iraqi army never surrendered to the Americans. There was no formal surrender. There was no formal, we beat them. The army just sort of melted away. So, Bremer has said, and other people have said, well, we were just formalizing something that was already the fact on the ground. Other people have said, well, the Iraqi army was both corrupt, dysfunctional, had a long-term reputation for war crimes, for brutality, had a bad relationship with the nation of Iraq. So, there was a lot of, they wanted to create a new Iraqi army and just wipe the slate clean. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. What I do think was bad is that they never got a formal surrender from the old Iraqi army. They never, so, that's an important symbolic.
They still thought of themselves as being the Iraqi army.
Right. And they disbanded the Iraqi army, but they never secured the military bases. So there was a ton of weapons still available, floating around, and all these former soldiers that basically took the weapons and went home. So you had the makings of an insurgent. You had the tinder there just waiting to be lit.
A bunch of guys that were in the military, now formally unemployed, or informally unemployed, nothing to do, in a country with no economy.
Right.
And who would have thought it?
Right.
Who would have thunk it that they would turn into an insurgency and try to retake their country?
Right. And I remain convinced that the insurgency has origins in the economic policies of the CPA. Shortly after...
Provisional Authority?
Coalition Provisional Authority. Shortly after Bremer signed into law the original general orders that disbanded the army, that sold off and privatized all the state-run businesses, that fired all the... that de-Baathified the government, that fired all the workers that worked in the state-owned businesses, and you had to be a member of the Ba'ath Party to do that. 4 weeks later, the first bombs went off in Baghdad. So I'm convinced, and after he fully did this, but unpegged the Iraqi dinar from the dollar on the world currency markets, and let the dinar float on its own, and paupered everybody, because it went overnight from 3 to 1 to about 2,000 to 1.
Well, that's I guess a little bit like what happened in Europe after World War II, where all of a sudden, instead of paying 100 lire for a loaf of bread, now you needed to pay 1,000,000 lire for a loaf of bread. The money just became pretty much worth almost as much as the paper it was printed on. Almost as much.
Right. Yes. In fact, we had little Iraqi kids selling us Iraqi dinar that was worth maybe $1 or less as souvenirs for $5. They were very, very capitalistic that way.
Kids will find a way to sell you lemonade or something.
That's right. And Americans, stupid as we were buying it. We don't have any idea how much things are worth. And $5 there is that's a lot of money, especially for a little kid. So it was a disaster. And to go back to the original question about Foley, his economic prescriptions were disastrous for Iraq, and I am convinced that had he become governor, he would have used the same menu of the same playbook, the same plays for Connecticut. It would have been disastrous for
privatizing everything he could.
Yes, selling off every bit of assets that belong to the state, privatizing everything that he can, firing state workers as much as possible, and I really think it would have destroyed Connecticut's economy. Probably something along the lines of like New Jersey, whose economy has tanked, or Wisconsin, or Kansas, if you have followed any of the state.
I know Wisconsin with Scott Walker, and Kansas with Sam Brown back, where they pretty much privatized everything, and
they have massive deficits,
and gave huge tax givebacks to the wealthy, and now massive deficits. And Kansas's economy is, whereas California, on the other side of the coin, California's economy is quite strong.
Right. Yes, and a lot of people say, well, Connecticut now has a deficit of $48 million, but it has a budget of $40 billion. So, it's really 0.1% deficit. I mean, by law, you still have to balance the budget, but in terms of, the relative size of the deficit, it's very tiny. And you can say that, well, we're going to have deficits going forward, but again, those deficits relative to the whole budget are very, very small.
Whereas the U.S. Deficit of $17 trillion is a lot of money. It's it's I guess maybe I'm going to guess a whole year's budget for the country.
Less than that, less than a whole year's budget. But our budget is we just passed a budget of $1 trillion, but our gross domestic product is like $20 trillion. So we're like our deficit, our overall debt is like 85% of our total annual product.
Okay, so we could shut down for a year. We could survive it.
Yes,
and likewise, Connecticut certainly could survive that small deficit relative to the entire
as
economy.
Opposed to other countries where people say, well, we're going to become like Greece or Italy, but those countries have deficits that are more than 100% of their annual product. So we're actually solvent. It's not true when people say that we're bankrupt. We're not. We produce more money than we owe.
So Foley, great gubernatorial candidate, or the greatest gubernatorial candidate in Connecticut ever?
I'm thrilled, absolutely thrilled with that he was not elected governor, because I really think he would have been bad for Connecticut, and I think it would have been not just bad, but a disaster for Connecticut. I think it would have been. I don't think there would have been insurgency in Connecticut, obviously, but I do think that the economic prescription that he had for Iraq would have been equally disastrous in Connecticut.
And some of the claims they made during the campaign, they made a claim that. Well, they've been saying this now ever since Dan Malloy became governor, that jobs would just flood away from Connecticut. Hasn't happened. That there would be unemployment. And in fact, during his first 4 years, there are more people employed in Connecticut than when he started.
Right.
Whereas the previous governor, who shall go nameless, Jody Rell, every 4-year term she had, and I think she had 3 of them maybe? 3 and a fraction?
She had 1 4-year term, but she took over for Rowland, who had 2 terms.
Okay.
So she was a lieutenant governor for Rowland, who had 2 terms.
So she had a term and a half, or a term and...
Correct.
During every 4-year segment that she was in power, and of course during Rowland's administrations prior to that, every 4 years Connecticut lost jobs.
That's correct.
Lost jobs, 4 years lost jobs, 4 years lost jobs, 4 years lost jobs. Dan Malloy, 4 years gained jobs. So where's their disconnect with all this?
Here's what I think is, at some point in the distant past, Connecticut put all of its bet on corporate jobs. The nature of corporations is to constantly downsize in order to reduce cost per unit. And what really produces jobs that we know about is small businesses. Small businesses produce 70% of the jobs, or 70% of the economy. And Connecticut has neglected small businesses. It does not have a constructive policy to promote or produce small businesses, or for small businesses to produce jobs. And that's where the error has been in Connecticut economics since 1990 or so.
So what did Dan Malloy do? What did the Connecticut legislature and Dan Malloy do in order to have us end up with more jobs at the end of this 4-year term than at the beginning?
Well, there's a couple parts to this. So one, there's a rising tide. So there are more jobs to be had overall. Connecticut, its recovery has lagged compared to some of the fastest growing states, but it has had some recovery. But some of the things like Connecticut Innovation and the Fast Five and some of the initiatives to promote STEM businesses in the state have contributed.
Science, technology, engineering, and math.
And Governor Malloy continues to promote that, and I think that the legislature is continuing to promote entrepreneurship in the state. And even since I moved here in 2007, there's been, I have noticed a change in the conversation around job production. It's become much more geared towards innovation in small businesses and startups, which I think is very, very healthy and bodes well for the future.
You've had a part in that too, actually, creating jobs for people that have come back from combat.
Right, and this is how I got involved in this whole sort of area. So I run a program called the Entrepreneur Boot Camp for Veterans with Disabilities. And actually, since the last time I was here, we just graduated our most recent class in October. So overall, in the last 5 years, we've graduated 110 veterans. We've started 70 businesses. The 70 businesses have produced more than $8.5 million in gross revenues, more than 140 jobs. So we are part of the solution overall for the state. And when I started doing this, we started looking at starting the program in 2009. Our first year was 2010. But we started talking about getting veterans into entrepreneurship, and nobody else in the state was talking about it. And we really became part of a larger conversation, but also added a dimension to the conversation that nobody else was talking about, which is veteran business entrepreneurship. Our state is particularly fertile grounds for veterans to own businesses. Since then, and as a result, Connecticut has more than 42,000 veteran-owned businesses that produce more than $20 billion worth of state product. And we've now formed a Connecticut Veterans Chamber of Commerce in order to harness all those businesses and to promote veteran business ownership to the state legislature, because we know and we can make the case that veterans produce value in our state.
Are there any jobs that veterans are more qualified, more capable, more likely to succeed at than other jobs?
Yes. Well, healthcare for sure. Our state is very competitive in the healthcare sciences. We have great medical schools. We have great pharmaceutical schools, and certainly the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army all have professionals who have that background and can come here and get credentialed and join the workforce. Also, tech, satellite communications, computer technology, and of course, we have a very strong defense industry here, so veterans can fit into the defense industry.
Are there any jobs that they're not especially inclined towards? I'm going to ask that because I've heard that it's very difficult for somebody that's been on the front lines in combat to acclimate themselves to a job where there's incredibly high levels of stress, like, for instance, being a police officer.
Many veterans default to, I want to get into one of the uniformed services. I want to be a fireman, I want to be a policeman, something like that, because they want that adrenaline rush. They're comfortable in a uniform, in a hierarchical. But I agree that those dynamics tend to exacerbate symptoms of, and they feel good because people can sort of go back to a mindset and a response that they had in combat when everything made sense, and it's like it was, and they're sort of relieved of the difficult work of having to undo all of that and fit in, in some other way. I mean, they're still contributing as policemen or firemen or whatnot, and I don't want to say that they're not, but I think it's important to undo the combat response.
You've been through that transition period where you come back and you're used to combat, you're used to the adrenaline rush, the incredibly intense situations that you have to learn how to handle as a member of any armed forces. What's it like going through that?
Very, very difficult. I actually think, for me, the definition of post-traumatic stress is a combat reaction in a non-combat environment. There's clinical definition, all this other stuff, but for me, shorthand is the combat response to a non-combat stimuli. So, it's difficult, and you often, or people often, don't respond appropriately to things that civilians take for granted, or deal with in an appropriate, mature manner on a daily basis, or things that would set a combat veteran off into what appear to be unprovoked rages or responses.
You mentioned on an earlier show when you were on about your first 4th of July back home, and how the noise of fireworks sounded enough like the noises of battle, where you actually had to hide in your foxhole, so to speak. You had to go down in your basement to escape that.
Yep.
And I can appreciate that. I mean, I think we're all we talk about fireworks and loud noises and things, and we say, "Ooh, that's so great." But quite frankly, they frighten everybody a little bit, I think. But particularly to someone that's had the A to B thing of an explosion and being injured immediately thereafter, you kind of get used to, correct me if I'm wrong, you kind of get used to, there's danger following that noise.
Right.
Serious danger.
And you can't control it. It's a automatic neurological response. It happens in milliseconds on a...
It's become embedded into you.
Yes. It creates a adrenal response. It creates a cortisol response. It creates a flight or flight response. A flight or fight response that you don't have control over. And I still try to avoid, and I know many veterans who try to avoid those sorts of...
I know you wear the dark glasses still, and that's partly because of the brightness.
Yeah, the light sensitivity.
The light sensitivity from having incredible flashes of light going on around you, going in conjunction with those incredibly loud noises.
From traumatic brain injury, there's some very common that light sensitivity is attendant to traumatic brain injury. And part of it is you have to learn and develop strategies to control your inputs, your sensory inputs.
Tell me about the strategies. What strategies? What works?
Physical strategies like having glasses on, or in my office, I tend to keep the lights off and things like that. But also, I try to control my environment where I am not in a large crowd where there's a tremendous amount of stimulus. I try to make sure that I'm always in a place where I have an exit, so I know I can multiple ways to get out of a situation. I often during the day have to I call it unplug, but just take a half hour to turn everything off, turn off all the electrical stuff, and just have no sensory input at all, and just sort of like a computer where you power down and let it cool down for a little bit. I really believe that that's very key.
That makes all the sense in the world, and probably would be beneficial to everybody to be able to say, hey, wait a second, I need to turn the switch off for 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes and decompress.
Yep.
Kind of like what a nap does, or a siesta, or anything that a person does to take a step back, take a deep breath, recompose themselves, and then go back into that work mode and be efficient.
Yes, absolutely. And now I have to be careful, and I have a strange sort of attraction between both watching and not watching war movies or stuff especially about Iraq.
Yeah.
It's like being drawn to a train wreck. And especially with what's going on in Iraq now has brought up a lot of things, because I'm still talking to Iraqis who are in Iraq, who are dealing with ISIS, as we speak. And obviously I was so invested in the origins of the Iraqi army, and now
you were part of the training of that army, post Saddam.
At the very beginning, we trained and built and led in combat the first Iraqi army battalion.
And we're going to come back in the second show and talk about that, because there's a lot of questions people have about what's going on in Iraq and why ISIS has seemingly strolled across the countryside and beaten back a much larger, much better equipped army of Iraqis that one would think would be motivated to defend their own country. But go on a little bit more about your own personal experience with the, and we'll get to that in the second show. More about your own personal experience about coming back from the war.
I was originally very, very profoundly alienated because I wanted to scream at people, there's a war going on and people are dying, and don't you know? I thought this should be the most important thing that everybody was dealing with. Everybody was wrapped up in their own lives and their daily...
So disconnected from something that they had no experience at. And, well, it's on the other side of the world, and, gee, we'd like to be successful there, but to people here in America, it just wasn't as important as it maybe should have been. Because a lot of people, very few people actually had kids or family members that were actually involved there. There was very little investment personally.
Most Americans are very disconnected from not just the war, but from the military. And then, I got involved in helping Iraqi interpreters come to the United States.
Yeah.
And I had my Iraqi interpreter living with me, and I was trying to get him situated. And when I talk to people about that, they say, "Oh, aren't they the enemy?" And you don't get it. They're not the enemy. They're, these are people who are trying to help Americans, and they're being victimized by, this. It was just very, very difficult to,
because of the way they dressed, or because of the language, because of the intonation. Why?
Why? What exactly?
Why were they? Why did people kind of think of them as being the enemy?
Oh, well, yeah. One, they're sort of brown and swarthy, and they have what Americans consider to be funny mannerisms, and they speak English generally with an accent. They're definitely foreigners, and people not inclined to help Iraq. I did help my interpreter get a job as a janitor. Now, he was a physicist in Iraq, but I helped him get a job as a janitor at a local hotel, and the guy who hired him said, "I'm going to do it because my son is a Marine and I want to help you out." So, we got him a job, and then, it helped his brothers come here, and helped his brothers get jobs, and, all this stuff. But
we're going to come back and do a second show and talk a little bit more about this whole notion of training the Iraqi army and equipping them and getting to defend their own country now that the United States does not have an active part in defending Iraq and keeping Iraq together. This is Lieutenant Colonel Michael Zacchea, retired from the United States Marine Corps, who was there training those forces, and he's going to tell us what he did and shed some light on what went wrong and why it isn't working. It's Progressive Soup. I'm David Stevenson.